Okay, welcome back. So if you recall, during the installation part, we got to this thing where when we were connecting to the database, it asked whether or not I wanted to use Windows authentication or server authentication. Actually, what it was is, do you want to use Windows integrated only, or do you want to use a combination of SQL authentication and server and Windows authentication? So what's the scenario where I would be forced into using that guy? What do you think? Well, it should be fairly obvious that Windows authentication only works on Windows. So if you're not on Windows, well, that won't work, right? Okay. So this is that choice that you get. Okay. All right. Now we've connected. Okay, so we've done this a lot, right? So this is nothing new. I mean, come on. This is that mixed mode thing. If I had said mixed mode, I would have had to have given it a password. Yep, if I had done that. And so when you connect, you got this little guy where it has the database engine and then the server name and the Windows authentication kind of a thing, right? We've seen this all before. Okay. So if you recall, there's actually two parts to this. Let me disconnect one more time and reconnect one more time. So the server name actually has two pieces to it. It's got the machine name, which in my case is TAMUCT10, and then a backslash, and then the instance name. Now, you and I did not pick the instance name. The machine picked it for us. And because we were installing the Express Edition, ours became SQL Express. We could have intervened and said, no, I want to call it Kumquat. But that's just the way it did it. Okay. So there's always two parts to this thing. All right. So let me go ahead and connect. So the database objects, right? So if I pick a database tab, there's a thing called the database snapshot. I'm not going to deal with that. But they also have something called system database. So let's look at that. There's master, model, and blah, 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 blah. What is all that stuff? Well, master, believe it or not, is the schema of what's installed. Basically, it's the thing that says, oh yeah, there's a Cape Cod database and there's a Chapter 1 database, okay? And I mentioned that occasionally, if you go and do a new query and you're not paying attention, that master is the one that comes up here, and we never, ever, ever, ever want to be using master. Basically, keep your hands off of master, okay? So that's why I always tell you, don't ever do it that way. If you want to do a query, go to the database and then go in here and say new query, and that way it automatically picks the right one and you don't accidentally. So if you do it the way I do it, you'll never accidentally hit master. Okay, so creating a new database on page 70. Okay, we've done this a gazillion times, but let's just go through it one more time. This time we're going to go through it a little slower. All right, so I'm going to do a right click, new database. I'm going to call this one Chapter 10. Okay, now this time, rather than just hitting the button, let's go look at what we just did. So there's two things that got built. There's a file type that has the rows of data. Okay, so this is the data file, and this is the log file. So when you create these things, it creates two things. Let's go see what they actually are called. I can't actually, well, I guess I could scoot that over a little bit. Okay. And so what it's going to do is it's going to put it in this location. You're going to need to know this location a little later on, but just bear with me. And then it's going to pick some file names for us. So Chapter 10, this is going to have a file extension of a particular type. So I'm going to go ahead and say, okay. All right, so now I have a Chapter 10 guy. All right, so the rows data is the honest to God data. The log is what's called the log file. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the difference is, here's what's permanent data, and here's all the historical stuff that happened to get there. Okay, kind of cool. All right, so on page 74, they start talking about, doing SQL statements. So this is not, again, if you do it the way I always do it, where you select the database first and then hit the new query, you don't ever have to worry about things getting messed up. Loading and executing pre-made scripts. We've done that, right? We've gone in here and, gone to the student data files and extracted files and just have an SQL extension, you click on it and they appear here. You hit execute and presto changeo. We've done that for all the ones we've done, right? No big deal. So if you go look at one of those guys, let's go look at one, but let's bring it up in like a notepad or something. So I'm going to bring up, I don't know, how about this guy? So instead of going to the SQL Server Management Studio, I'm deliberately going to open it in the notepad. Okay, so it says start using the master, which is okay. And then this go command. Now, technically, go is not an SQL statement. Technically, what this is a separator for SQL Server Management Studio. So it's not actually an SQL command. Basically means I'm done, move on, okay? And then creating an instance, and then using that, creating a database, and then using that data. And then here's some stuff just to make sure that we treat the null characters the way we're supposed to treat them. And then this quoted identifier thing basically talks about, you know, how you should put quotes, and how, like if you had a field name that had spaces in it or something like that. So these are kind of sort of default. And then we created a table, and we created a constraint, and then we did inserts on that. So it's all separated by goes. So we've seen this before, right? Good. So let's talk about how we're going to look at some data. I'm going to go into, I don't know, let's go into VRG and pull up a particular table. And let's say I want to see how they did that. Well, right click, and then you say design. Okay, this will give me a view of the design of this thing. So it tells me that there's artist, and that's a primary key. There's a last name, and it's a char, and nationality, and date of birth, and deceased, and all the rest of these things. Okay, kind of straightforward. The database diagram, we've done that a couple of times. I basically always start at the database diagram. I mean, to me, that is probably the first thing I do when I get handed a database, just to see how it's supposed to work. Okay, you can zoom in on these things. I'm going to go zoom to fit, although I won't be able to read it. Okay, so we've seen all that before. Again, same old, same old. If you don't see the 3-part column definition in here, that's because you haven't followed instructions on how to configure SQL Server Management Studio. On page 94, they start talking about indexes. So one more time, we've talked about this before, but so just some of this is a repeat. I'm going to drill into the artist and go into the index section. And it basically has 2 indexes. It has the index associated with the primary key, and then the index associated with this alternate key. And I don't remember what the alternate key, oh yeah, I do. The alternate key is the first name and last name. Okay, so it has 2 indexes in here. So if I ask you, where do you find the indexes for the column for the artist table? Well, it's under the artist table, okay? So the indexes are associated with the table. Okay, good. Now, one more time. Indexes are designed to speed up searches. A typical place for where a search occurs is the where clause. So if I ask, you know, where artist ID is equal to 12, then that's going to speed up the search of that particular thing. So any column that you routinely search on probably ought to have an index. Okay, good. Now, an awful lot of SQL statements you routinely use the where clause. I mean, the select statement uses it a lot, you know, the update and delete and, you know, those kind of things. But insert typically does not. Normally you don't have a where clause on insert because inserts always go to the bottom of the table, right? Always. They always just go at the bottom. So there's no way you can tell it, oh, I want it up here at the top. So normally there's no where clause on insert. So indexes could actually slow down inserts. It's possible. Okay, on page 109, they start talking about importing Excel data. So I'm going to pretend, I'm not actually going to do it, but I'm going to go over here to the Start menu and go to the Import and Export guy. Right here, Import and Export. We've done this before, where it comes up and allows me to to get like an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV file. Lots and lots of different types. In fact, let's just take a look at what. So a flat file with an Excel, a Microsoft Access file, and all these other things. There's lots of things in here that you could pull from. So the one we did before was a Microsoft Excel file. And I mentioned that there's some problems when you're pulling stuff together. If you have a 64-bit version of SQL Server and you're trying to connect to a 32-bit version of Excel, sometimes you have some problems. Those problems are primarily gone now, but that's okay. There's some other ways you can do this. If you're in well, hang on. So I go here to VRG, and I want to go to Tasks, and one of the things it has is import data or import flat file. Okay, this basically does the same thing, right? It's the exact same thing. You just don't have to go out to the command prompt and hit it, right? No big deal. All right, good. All right, so I'm gonna skip a bunch of that. So on page 118, they start talking about persistent stored modules, right? We talked about that. That's the programming part where you actually write stored procedures. And what was the key feature of a stored procedure? I'm not gonna tell you. You're gonna have to remember. Okay, user-defined functions, yep. And then triggers, we mentioned triggers. We didn't actually do one, we mentioned them. Okay, so next, on page 115, we need to talk about concurrency control. Now, this is a big one, because we talked about concurrency before, and so let's just make sure we got it all straight, because now we're talking about the SQL Server view of this, okay? So they have a thing called a transaction isolation level, okay? And if you pick a transaction isolation level, then it's for every connection that you make. When you connect to the database, just when you pick that. So I could connect to the database with one isolation level, disconnect and reconnect with another one. Okay, good. And you can have read uncommitted, recommitted, repeatable, snapshot, and serialization. Those are my choices. If you had cursors, and I'm going to completely ignore cursors because you could write an application that used cursor using primarily things that happened in stored procedures, then you can have read-only and scroll and optimistic. But then they have the locking hints. Remember we had the with statement? So I could throw in, you know, I want to do select asterisk from artist, and then I could say with read committed or read uncommitted or repeatable read or all these other kind of things. So this is how you can influence the database into picking the correct lock that you think is the most appropriate. Okay, so that's how that works. So this is just a repeat from Chapter 9, but this is the scope in which they work. The select statements have these guys, and then the transaction isolation you get to pick. Okay, so I'm ready to move on. On page 158, they start talking about security. Now this is a little complicated, all right? So the server, and I'm going to say server instance, the server instance has server logins, server roles, and server permissions. And then each database could have database users, database roles, and database permissions. And then each database could have multiple schemas. Now we have not been using schemas at all right? So in our case, we only have one schema, and it's called DBO. And then it could have some permissions, and that's where you apply particular permissions to a table or to a column or to a stored procedure, things like that. Okay, so this is how this thing maps out. So one of the things you're going to have to remember is that logins associated with the server and users associated with the database. You're going to remember that, aren't you? Yes, logins are associated with the server and users are associated with the database. Okay, this is a good place to stop.